Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another episode of UBS Road to the Election and Election Watch series. I'm thrilled to welcome today's guest, Apollo Lupescu from Dimensional Fund Advisors. Apollo, good to have you here in the studio.
Anthony, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're in this place now, Apollo, where everybody's anticipating this, most important election of your life election this November.
Right.
And it seems like every 4 years we say it's the most important election of your lifetime. And for lots of reasons, maybe this is, right? A lot of policies that are potentially on the docket, et cetera. But there's always questions from our clients and, investors alike who wonder about the relationship between politics and the markets. And there seems to be this essence of them being intertwined. You must get that question a lot. So what are you saying to people who ask you, why are they so connected?
Well, Anthony, the answer is they're absolutely intertwined. And what's fascinating is if you go back to 1784, one of the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, wrote the charter for Bank of New York, which today is BNY Mellon. And 5 years later, in 1789, Bank of New York lent the U.S. government its first loan, $200,000, which went to pay the salaries of congressmen and George Washington, for that matter.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is this relationship has been in place for so long, so there's nothing new, and my guess is it will continue to exist for the foreseeable future.
I love hearing history like that because it's so fascinating to go back. Obviously, most people now know Hamilton from the musical on Broadway, et cetera, and the songs, and he was the first head of the Treasury. But that little piece of history is really fascinating and really interesting to maybe give a reason why people connect government and politics. So here's the other question I bet you get often is, it must be that Republican presidents see better returns for the market, or Democrat presidents do better than Republicans when it comes to the S&P. It doesn't seem to be that way, however.
Right. And what's interesting is that when I think about politics and I talk to my family, my friends, it seems to trigger very strong emotions. And it is because it touches our deeply held beliefs, our core identity as individuals. And because of that, it triggers those emotions. And Anthony, I actually think it's perfectly fine to have those emotions because that's what makes us human. And it's actually perfectly fine to act upon those emotions. And probably the best way to act is go vote or get involved into a campaign if you really believe in that candidate. What I think it's interesting is that very successful investors are able to acknowledge those emotions and at the same time be very pragmatic in the way that they make decisions about their money. And in that respect, instead of making decisions based on how they feel, look at the data and the evidence. So what I'm going to do right now is not tell you how I feel. I don't want to make anybody actually feel good or bad about their political views because everybody's entitled to them. But rather, I'm going to look at data. What does the data say when it comes to elections, presidents, and the stock market? And I don't know about you, but I'm born in 1969. Divulging my age, I'm 54 years old.
I'm not that far behind you.
I'm about to be 55. And I was interested in my lifetime of presidents. How did the market do with different presidents? And over the course of my entire lifespan, the average return of the U.S. stock market, the S&P 500, has been roughly about 10%. So let's just put that as a bogey. 10% per year on average, annualized, that's what the market has done, the S&P 500. And if you go in my lifetime, the very first president when I was born was Richard Nixon. And he was in the office for over 5 years. And on average per year, on an annualized basis, when he was in the White House, the stock market, the S&P 500, actually dropped by 2.9% per year. So the very first president of my lifetime, the market did not go up on an annualized basis, but it went down.
Well, we know Nixon certainly had his troubles.
Absolutely.
So that makes sense.
And he also 73, 74, and the oil embargo and all this stuff. But then he leaves office, and President Ford comes along, and for the 3.5 years or so that he was in office, the market actually skyrockets at 20.2% per year annualized, which is a huge difference from what Nixon had in his time.
Yeah, and historically, those are massive returns.
Massive returns. And you fast forward again, and you have President Bush, you have President Obama, 16% per year while he was in office for 8 years. And then after that, President Trump at about 15.2% per year. So to me, when I look at these numbers, Anthony, the first question that I get is, can you find evidence that having a Republican or a Democrat in the White House is better or worse for the markets?
Right. Clearly, the answer is no.
There's no pattern to be distinguished. You can't, if you look at these numbers, there's no chance that you can tell me that one is better than the other. We had two presidents, Republicans with negative outcomes. We had presidents, Democratic presidents with positive, Republicans with positive. There's no rhyme or reason to that. The second question is, should presidents even get credit or blame for how the market does during their lifetime, during their presidency, not lifetime, but during the time they're in the White House? And in my opinion, no. And I look at President George W. Bush, and you look and you say, well, negative 4.4% per year, he was not a good president for the stock market. When in fact, he cut taxes to dividends and long-term capital gains. So how did the market do so poorly then? Well, he walked in just as the dot-com was going bust. How much did he have to do with the dot-com going bust? Nothing. 9/11 happened 9 months into his term, and then he walks off at the very bottom of the financial crisis. So should we say that he was not a good president for the markets? I don't think that's fair.
Right, a lot of extenuating circumstances for him as he walked in, as you just talked us through.
And you put the shoe on the other foot. President Bill Clinton, he walked in just as the dot-com was taken off. And in reality, how much did the White House have to do with Pets.com and all the other stocks that powered the 90s?
That's right.
And talk about market timing, he left the White House just before it went south. So none of these downturns kind of reflected in his time in office. So to me, whether it's looking on the upside or the downside, I don't think it's fair to assign credit or blame to a president. But the last question is, well, shouldn't the policies of the president matter? So you have President Reagan, 15.8, President Obama, 16, virtually identical. One very business friendly, the other one focused on social programs. So again, when you look at all of these numbers, there doesn't appear to be any clear evidence that having a Republican or a Democrat, that the policies of the president would have a significant impact on the market.
Right. It's kind of like baking cookies, right? You can't bake cookies with just flour. It's not just one thing that makes a cookie. You have to have eggs, you have to have milk or water or baking soda. So there's a lot of variables that go into how well or how not well the S&P 500 or the markets in general will do. So you can't just blame it or give credit to one person or one administration. There's a Federal Reserve that's also there. There's the Treasury. There's Congress. There's, which is the other question that we always get was, what about Congress? Divided, partisan, bipartisan. How does that play into the success or failure of the markets?
January of 21, there was a special election in Georgia. And the Democrats won the 2 Senate races. And at that point, the Democrats controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House at exactly the same time. So back then, I had this thought that there's a natural experiment to be had. What if you look at times in the market when one party controlled everything, the White House, the Senate, and the House, and at that point there's no place to hide. You control everything. The agenda is controlled by one party, and then you can compare the two parties. If one had control of these 3 branches, I mean the Senate, the House, and the White House, and you compare with the times when the other party had that complete control, let's call it unified government control. Not that they're holding hands and singing Kumbaya, but they just control everything. And I did an experiment like that back in 21. And I looked at the data in the S&P 500 going back to the 1920s, as long as we have good data in the S&P 500 index. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that during the 90-plus year time frame, the Republicans had unified government control for 13 years. And in those 13 years, if you simply do an average of the market returns in those 13 years, the market return was 14.52%, which is it's a simple average, so it's a little bit higher than the annualized. It's just a little math.
Right.
But what's interesting is that the Democrats also had this unified government control. And so the Democrats had a lot longer government
almost double, triple of that number.
Exactly,
wow.
Right. So a lot longer. So the question is, how did the markets do when the Democrats had the unified government control? Because at that point, you can point and say, well, now I can tell that one party is better than the other. On average, per year, they're doing 34 years of the Democratic unified government control, the market went up by 14.52%.
So it's the exact number.
Identical
Identical
to
number.
the second decimal. Identical to the second decimal.
That's
Whether
fascinating.
you had the Republican unified control, the Democratic unified control, the average market return between 1926 and 2020 was 14.52%, identical to the second decimal. So when people are telling you that one party is better than the market than the other, there's no data to support it. When they're saying, I'm going to sell everything and move to Canada because one party is going to win or the other, that's emotions talking. It's not the data. There's no evidence to suggest that one party is clearly better for the market than the other. Now, it's interesting that you talked about the variables in the market. I do think that politics and elections matter to the market. I don't think they're irrelevant. Absolutely, they matter. But the way you put it is very clever. It's one of the many variables that impacts the performance of the market. It just doesn't happen to be a primary one.
Right.
That you look and say, aha, that's clearly better or worse for the markets. It's one of the many variables that impacts the market. It's not a primary one. And I loved the analogy that he made. Because I bake cookies with my daughter, and when he put in the eggs, the flour, the sugar, the butter, all these things, and you mix it in, you make the cookie. When you break the cookie open, to your point, you can't point and say, aha, I can see the egg yolk in there. No, you can't. So to me, politics is more like the egg yolk rather than the garlic in the cookie.
Somebody must have made that mistake in their lifetime and can relate to that.
So to me, again, folks, when you think about politics and elections and what to do with your money, there is no evidence that you should make a move with your money because of politics. It's much more acknowledging those emotions. That's what we're feeling. You look at the data, any way you cut it. I think that investors should stay disciplined, stick with their plan rather than make decisions based on who's going to get elected or not. Because again, it's emotions.
Yeah, that is literally the perfect way to end our conversation, because you started with the emotional aspect of going into the voting booth. Use your emotions there. Vote on what you believe in. But when it comes to your portfolio, your investments, take the emotion out. We always recommend working with a financial advisor. He or she knows your best case scenario, knows what's in store for you, your plan, etc. So, Apollo, thank you. I'm glad we tied it really in a nice, neat little bow. The cookies can go inside the basket. We'll tie that up and deliver them.
No garlic in cookies.
No garlic in those cookies. Great, Apollo. Really nice to have you. And thanks for taking us through that history lesson. Really good stuff.
Great fun talking to you.
Great. Good to see you. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. We wish you a great day, everybody. Go bake some cookies, and we'll see you soon.